Hi all. So today we'll be going through a typical market failure question and how do we answer this essay accordingly. This paper is part of the revision package for promos, practice paper 1, essay 3 of market failure. First, we look at the preamble of the question, which says to reap the full benefits to both the child and the society, Singaporean children are required by law to attend primary school under the Compulsory Education Act. So take note, okay, that this is involving the child and the society. So this should be ringing some alarm bells about how there is something related to the individual and there's also something related to third parties, which could influence your answer when looking at the questions. So firstly, let's look at A. We will answer why the government wants to intervene in the market for primary education. And then in B, we will discuss the different policies to actually tackle the market failure. So take note on the phrasing of the different questions. Okay, this is a very typical market failure related question. So if you see something related to this or similar to this, the bells in your head should be ringing already. It should be telling you, okay, this should be something related to market failure. So for question interpretation, we must first identify the market. So the market here is primary school education, which actually represents a merit good, okay, which has positive externalities, as well as it may have issues related to imperfect information, and which both contribute to an underconsumption of education. So to achieve a good analytical answer, contextualization to Singapore plus the market of primary school education is absolutely needed. Looking at the question specifically, the commando is actually explained, which refers to giving a detailed account of. For market failure, this generally means using the 7-step framework to establish the reasons for market failure. This is further added on when we look at the idea of rationale for government intervention. Generally speaking, the government's microeconomic objectives are efficiency and equity. Looking at the good, we must identify what are the reasons for the government to intervene and which of these objectives may actually not be met. So, looking at this, we can now look at our approach. So for our approach, we must always remember that we have to identify two requirements at the very least. In this case, you can actually have an optional third requirement. So with our previous explanation, we understand that primary school education is likely to have two different causes of market failure which caused this inefficient allocation of resources. This actually has the idea of underconsumption. We could also optionally talk about equity, but for the J1 level, we will focus on the two causes, which is positive externalities and imperfect information. Lastly, we have to contextualize our answers based on the Singapore primary education market. This entails that our MPB, MPC, as well as third-party benefits and info gap has to be based on Singapore's primary education market. So this will be explained when we look at our different requirements. But just have to take note, we need to contextualize our answers to get that great script. Now we move on to the approach. So nothing new here. We have our intro, which always comprises of our definitions, as well as a rough overview of what we're going to be talking about our essay. Secondly, we have our body, which is our R1 and R2, which comprises of our causes of market failure. You could also have our optional R3 of inequity. Lastly, the conclusion is your summary of points. So take note, this is a 10-mark question. Usually, you write a bit shorter for this, so you must be able to succinctly explain all these different things and hit the different requirements. The introduction actually helps to set the tone by defining market failure, as well as an overview of the causes we will explain. We know that merit goods are underconsumed, and we introduce the reasons for the underconsumption here. So we give a brief overview of positive externalities and imperfect info. We also explain how market failure actually occurs here. Firstly, we will explain our requirement 1, which is our 7-steps process to explain market failure. So when we explain market failure, we always begin by defining QF. So in this case, okay, we define QF and we give relevant examples of MPB and MPC based on the context. So the context here is primary school education in Singapore. And we give the relevant examples, MPB being your increased wages or knowledge as a result of your increased years of education. Your MPC generally tends to be your cost, which is like your school fees, your examination fees, etc. So we must always contextualize our MPB and MPC. So take note, this is something quite a lot of answers lacked when we marked the previous two times about market failure. So just take note here. Secondly, we always must state our assumptions. So our assumption here, because we are talking about positive externalities, is that there are no external costs. So therefore, there is no MEC here, and MPC equals to MSC, which will also show in our diagram. Lastly, okay, we must talk about the divergence in context. So this will be reflected as the MAB, which we in turn must contextualize. An important thing to note is that when explaining your MAB, the link to third parties must be extremely explicit here. The examples you give must involve neither the producers or consumers of the good. So good examples of this could include society being impacted or employers being impacted. So I want you all to really pay attention to this and take note, because this is extremely important. If you do not give an explicit link to the third party, you are not explaining external benefits. After explaining and defining QF, as well as explaining our divergence in context, we must now define QS. So we define QS as where MSB equals to MSC. We can then show our market failure through stating the underconsumption, as well as showing the dead weight loss, as well as the reason for the dead weight loss. So take note on how we identify and shape the dead weight loss here. So always remember, the dead weight loss is the area between QF and QS with the arrowhead here pointing towards QS. So take note, this is always the case for the dead weight loss. So this is something I need you guys to be cognizant of and make sure that you always get this correct. So this concludes our 7-step explanation for how positive externalities actually lead to market failure. So take note of the boxes in purple, which actually details the steps. This can be used for other markets and can actually be used with some modifications for the other causes of market failure, which we will show again when we talk about our R2. So similarly for imperfect information, we also need to identify QF, QS as well as our assumptions. What is different for this case here is that in imperfect information, we explain our divergence differently. So the divergence here is actually due to MPB perceived being lower than MPB actual due to the information gap. So we need to contextualize our information gap as the long-term benefits of primary education. Once again, we need to be cognizant of how imperfect information is actually different from positive externalities. In this case, for imperfect information, we do not appreciate the long-term benefits, which therein lies our information gap. However, for positive externalities, we do not take into account third-party benefits, so it's different here. So this is why it is important to contextualize and not mix up third-party benefits with information gap. So here we explain that this undervaluation of marginal private benefit would actually exacerbate or make worse the underconsumption problem, because there is positive externalities and there is also this information gap. So there is a larger underconsumption, and this actually leads to a larger dead weight loss. Take note also on our example of imperfect information. See how it is extremely different from the idea of third-party benefits. It is very clear that we are talking about long-term benefits. So we make it very distinct between external benefits and the idea of positive externalities and imperfect information. So ultimately, the consumption of primary education will be lower than it should be. So now we look at the diagram as well. So looking at the diagram, okay, similar to the previous diagram, but here instead, we see that the divergence is actually between MPB perceived and MPB actual. We also note that the divergence is caused by the imperfect information, which is due to the info gap, and we see that the dead weight loss is also the same. So this is how you draw the diagram for imperfect information. Take note the different labels. Take note, this is our mark scheme. So look at the L3, okay, which we should all strive for, is that we want to see excellent analytical explanations of R1 and R2. So this consists of your 7 steps to explain market failure. Take note of the last point about how the response must be well contextualized. And compare that to L2, which says that the response may be rehearsed or is not so well contextualized. So take note, okay, contextualizing your answers, your examples of your MEB, your third-party benefits, your MPB, MPC, as well as your information gap has to be relevant to the context involved, which is primary school education. So this is to discourage students from just rehearsing answers and not using your analytical mind to really contextualize your answer. So take note, we are all should strive for L3, especially for this market failure question. It's a very standard 7 steps. Okay, we just need to make sure that we contextualize our answers.